Tuesday nights were usually the same in the Whitman house. Preston came home around 6 after checking on one of his cleaning crews downtown. He liked walking the buildings after hours, making sure the floors were polished right, the trash bins emptied, the bathrooms smelling like bleach instead of yesterday's filth. That was his name on the contracts, and he made sure the work lived up to it. Valerie sat at the kitchen table when he walked in. Takeout containers half open, her glass of wine already half gone. Their daughter, Luna, was upstairs in her room, violin practice drifting faintly through the ceiling. The house felt lived in, warm, ordinary. At least for one last night. Preston slid his jacket off and loosened his tie. He set his phone down, grabbed a fork, and sat across from her. He was tired, the kind of tired a man feels after spending 20 years building something from nothing. A business, a home, a family. Tired, but settled. Or so he thought. "How was your day?" he asked, spearing a cold noodle. Valerie didn't look up from her phone. She scrolled with her thumb, shrugged, and said, "Fine." Her voice was flat, empty. He'd learned to expect that tone lately, but tonight it carried something heavier. He didn't press. He just kept chewing, watching her over the rim of his fork. And then, as if she was commenting on the weather, she said, "I've been sleeping with Neil." Preston froze. Not a dramatic freeze. No fork clattering to the plate. No gasp. Just stillness. His jaw tightened. His chest stopped for a beat. Neil Caldwell, her boss, the man who signed her paychecks, who always seemed a little too smooth when they shook hands at company dinners. Preston's mind flicked through a dozen little moments, and suddenly they all connected. Late nights at the office, business trips that ran long. The way she smiled at her phone sometimes was like she was reading poetry, not emails. He waited for her to say more, maybe an apology, maybe some explanation. Instead, she finally set her phone down, looked at him, and said two words that cut deeper than the confession itself. "So what?" Not "I'm sorry." Not "it was a mistake." Just a shrug, as if 15 years of marriage and a daughter together were worth less than the wine in her glass. Preston leaned back in his chair. He didn't yell, didn't pound the table, didn't give her the satisfaction of a scene. Instead, he stared at her with the kind of silence that burned hotter than words. She picked her phone back up, dismissing him like he was a coworker she just brushed off in a meeting. That was the moment, the exact second something inside him shifted. Most men think betrayal comes with fireworks. Screaming, plates breaking, neighbors hearing the fight through the walls. But Preston knew better now. The real death of a marriage was quiet, almost surgical. Two words. "So what?" A shrug, a sip of wine, and everything he'd built drained out like someone had cut the bottom out of the bucket. He chewed once more, swallowed, and pushed his plate away. "All right," he said finally, voice steady. "Then we're done." She blinked at him, surprised he hadn't begged, argued, or pleaded. Maybe she wanted a fight. Maybe she wanted proof she still mattered enough to stir his anger. But Preston wasn't giving her that. He stood, slid his chair back under the table, and carried his fork to the sink. Rinsed it off, wiped his hands on a dish towel. Every movement is calm, measured, final. Behind him, Valerie muttered something under her breath, but he didn't ask her to repeat it. I didn't need to. He'd heard enough. Upstairs, Luna's violin hit a sharp note, then steadied again. Preston glanced up at the ceiling. That sound grounded him, reminded him what mattered, what was worth protecting. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair, slipped it on, and looked at Valerie one last time. She was still on her phone, face lit by the blue glow, glass of wine in her other hand. Preston's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm when he said, "You wanted me to know. Now I know." Then he walked out of the kitchen, the house suddenly colder than it had ever felt. Preston woke before dawn, the kind of restless sleep where you're not sure if you ever closed your eyes. He sat on the edge of the bed staring at the dim outline of the dresser, the faint glow of the clock reading 4:52. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Valerie lay on her side with her back to him, breathing slow and steady like she didn't have a care in the world. "So what?" The words replayed in his head, blunt and dismissive. He could almost still hear the shrug in her voice. He stood quietly, pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, and went downstairs. He brewed coffee just for something to do with his hands. Then he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, the same table where she had gutted their marriage the night before. Valerie thought she was clever. But Preston had built his company by paying attention to details others missed. He knew her habits. He knew she reused weak passwords, usually some combination of Luna's birthday and their anniversary. She was careless. She thought she was smarter than she was. He logged into the family cloud account, the one she thought he never bothered with. Within minutes, he was looking at her photo backups. At first, it was nothing unusual. Selfies with friends, Luna's school concerts, a few birthday cakes. Then he found a folder from the Atlanta conference last month. Dinner at a dimly lit restaurant. Wine glasses clinking. Valerie's smile wider than it had been at home in years. Another shot of her in the hotel bar, head tilted, laughing at something just outside the frame. He zoomed in on the reflection in the window behind her. Neil Caldwell, suit jacket off, tie loosened, watching her like a man who already owned her. Preston scrolled through dozens more. Little moments she hadn't meant to save, but the cloud captured anyway. Her hand resting on Neil's arm. Hotel receipts emailed to her account. The timestamps told a story longer than she had admitted. This wasn't some recent fling. It had been months. Maybe longer. The betrayal settled deeper. She hadn't just cheated. She'd lied about the scope. Shaved off months like that somehow made it less rotten. His coffee had gone cold by the time Luna padded down the stairs. She wore her pink pajama pants and a messy bun. Violin case slung over her shoulder like always. "Morning, Dad," she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. "Morning, kiddo," Preston said, shutting the laptop before she could see. She opened the fridge, poured herself orange juice, then leaned against the counter watching him. Kids notice more than adults think. "Are you and Mom fighting?" she asked bluntly. The question hit harder than the photos. Preston's throat tightened, but he kept his voice even. "Why do you ask?" "You didn't say goodnight last night," she said. "And you're never on your computer this early unless something's wrong." Preston studied her. 12 years old, sharp as a tack, already reading situations like a detective. She deserved better than lies, but she also deserved protection. "Your mom and I are having some differences," he said carefully. "But it's not your fault, and I'll make sure you're okay. That's my job." Luna frowned, clearly unsatisfied with the half answer, but she nodded. She picked up her violin case and headed for the door to catch the early bus to orchestra practice. "Dad?" she said before leaving. "Yeah. You're not gonna leave me, right?" The words sliced him open. He crossed the room, set a hand on her shoulder, and looked her in the eye. "No, never. No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you. That's a promise." She nodded again, this time with a little more trust, then slipped out the door. When the house went quiet again, Preston reopened the laptop. He stared at the photos one more time, not to punish himself, but to burn the truth into his memory. Valerie's lie was bigger than a one-night mistake. It was a second life. A life she thought she could juggle while he paid the mortgage and raised their daughter. He closed the laptop slowly. The anger was still there, sharp and heavy, but now it had focus. Valerie thought, so what? Was the end of the conversation. She had no idea it was just the start. Upstairs, she shifted in bed, probably waking to another day of pretending. But Preston had already made his decision. This wasn't going to be a screaming match. This was going to be evidence, strategy, and consequences. The kind that left no doubt. By Thursday, Preston had seen enough photos to know Valerie's, so what was only the tip of the rod. He needed to see it with his own eyes, not on a screen. He followed her on her lunch break. Nothing dramatic, just parked his truck down the block from her office and waited. Years of managing crews had taught him patience. Men who mop floors at midnight don't get noticed. Neither did he, sitting behind his tinted windshield. Valerie stepped out just before noon, dressed sharper than she ever did for him anymore. She wasn't alone. Neil Caldwell walked beside her, close enough their shoulders brushed when they laughed. Preston followed at a distance, steady, deliberate. They stopped at a restaurant on 3rd Street, the kind with big windows and linen napkins. He didn't go in. He didn't need to. He stayed outside, across the street, watching through the glass like a man studying a play he already knew the ending to. Neil leaned in as she talked, his hand brushing hers across the table. She giggled. An actual giggle, the kind Preston hadn't heard since the early years of their marriage. She touched her hair, smiled wide, glowed in a way she hadn't at home in months. Preston stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, jaw tight. No yelling, no pounding on the glass, no scene. Just watching, letting the truth soak in until it hardens. The meal stretched nearly an hour. When they finally left, Preston followed again, far enough not to be noticed. They drove together in Neil's car, pulling into a medical complex on the edge of downtown. Preston parked across the lot, watching as they disappeared inside. 20 minutes later, Valerie came out alone. She clutched a small envelope of glossy prints, her hand trembling slightly as she studied them before tucking them into her purse. She looked nervous, almost fragile. Preston didn't need to see the images to know what they were. He'd seen enough friends walk out of OB clinics with the same envelope, the same stunned expression. Ultrasound photos. His stomach turned. It wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just late nights and excuses. She was carrying Neil's child. The anger inside him tightened, sharper now, cleaner. It wasn't wild or reckless. It was a steady flame, the kind that forges steel. He sat in his truck for a long moment, breathing slow. Around him, life carried on. Cars pulling in, people walking to appointments, a mother scolding a child for running too far ahead. Ordinary life. Except he was gone. Valerie climbed into Neil's car again. Preston didn't follow this time. He didn't need to. He had seen enough. She had chosen another man, another future, another family. And she'd done it with a shrug, 2 words, and no thought for the daughter waiting upstairs at home. Preston gripped the steering wheel, the leather creaking under his hands. He could feel the rage pressing, begging to be released. But instead of exploding, he let it settle. Controlled. Directed. This wasn't the moment to strike. Not yet. Instead, he turned the key, started the truck, and pulled out of the lot. He knew where he was going. He needed advice and he needed a strategy. The next move would not be anger. It would be precision. By Friday, Preston knew he couldn't carry this storm alone. He needed a plan, not just fury, and he knew exactly where to start. David Richardson had been his lawyer for years, a steady hand whenever contracts or liability issues popped up with the cleaning company. Ex-cop turned attorney, David wasn't the kind of man who sugarcoated. Preston trusted him because he didn't need to. He called that afternoon. "Got time to talk?" "Always," David said. "Bring coffee. And don't sound like that unless it's serious." In David's office, Preston laid everything out. Valerie's confession, the photos, the lunch with Neil, the ultrasound envelope. David didn't interrupt, just scribbled notes and occasionally raised an eyebrow. When Preston finished, the lawyer leaned back in his chair and tapped his pen on the desk. "She gave you so what?" David asked. "Word for word." David shook his head. "Cold woman. All right. First step, don't blow up. No yelling, no threats. She wants a reaction she can twist. Give her nothing but paperwork." That was the language Preston understood. Evidence, contracts, proof. Together they compiled a file, hotel receipts, credit card charges, synced photos, messages. Everything is documented and neatly ordered. Then David added the big pieces. Divorce papers, prenup clauses, and paternity test requirements. "This," David said, sliding the stack across the desk, "is a sword. You swing it when you're ready. Until then, you keep it sheathed." Preston nodded. Felt like holding a loaded gun, but one he didn't need to fire recklessly. That night, Valerie came home glowing. Preston watched her float through the kitchen, wine glass in hand, humming to herself like a teenager. She didn't even notice the quiet calculation in his eyes. He sat at the table, calm. No argument, no accusations. Just a small black flash drive in the center of the table, beside a folded piece of paper. She frowned when she saw it. "What's this?" "You'll figure it out," Preston said evenly, standing up. He grabbed his jacket from the chair, slipped it on, and kissed Luna goodnight as she passed through the hall with her violin case. "Dad, where are you going?" she asked. "Hotel for a few nights," he said, squeezing her shoulder gently. "Call me if you need anything." He didn't wait for Valerie's response. Didn't watch her open the note. He left the house with the same calm steps he'd walked into courtrooms for business disputes. Steady, certain, controlled. At the hotel, he finally allowed himself to exhale. His phone buzzed within an hour, first one message, then 5, then 20. Valerie's name flashing again and again. He ignored them, set the phone face down, and poured himself a glass of water. He pictured her at the kitchen table opening the flash drive, seeing the receipts, the photos, the timelines, reading the note. "You wanted me to know. Now I do. The rest is between lawyers. Don't speak to me without one present." He imagined the panic in her face when she realized this wasn't a fight she could giggle her way out of. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug with, "So what?" Preston stood at the window of the hotel room, looking out over the city lights. For the first time all week, he felt steady. This wasn't rage anymore. This was preparation. Valerie had detonated their marriage with 2 words. Now she was going to learn what those words cost. And the bill was coming due. The first call came before sunrise. Preston ignored it. By the third, he picked up, not out of pity, but because he wanted to hear the panic in her voice. "Preston." Valerie's words tumbled out, frantic, almost breathless. "Where are you? We need to talk. Please. You can't just leave a..." He cut her off, calm as a man reading the weather report. "You said so what? Remember." There was silence on the other end. He let it stretch until she started stammering. "That's not what I meant. I wasn't thinking. Please, let me explain." "You explained plenty," he said. "I don't need any more." And he hung up. The phone buzzed again seconds later. He turned it face down on the nightstand, climbed into bed, and slept harder than he had all week. By mid-morning, the calls had shifted from pleading to angry voicemails. She cursed, threatened, begged again, cycling through every tone in the book. Preston listened to none of it. Then Neil Caldwell called. Preston let it ring twice before answering. "Whitman," Neil said, his voice smug, rehearsed. "Look, I know emotions are high right now. Valerie told me about your little stunt with the flash drive. Clever, but come on, you don't want to drag this into court. That's bad for everyone." Preston didn't speak. He let the silence hang until Neil cleared his throat. "I'll make you an offer," Neil continued. "Cash. Clean split. You walk away quietly. I make sure Valerie's taken care of, Luna too. No one has to get ugly." Preston finally spoke, voice low, even. "You're trying to buy me off like one of your contractors." "Business is business," Neil said, smugness creeping back. "We all win if you don't make this personal." Preston's jaw flexed, but his voice stayed steady. "It got personal the second you put your hands on my wife and lied to my daughter's face by existing in her home. There's no check big enough to cover that." Neil chuckled, the kind of laugh men use when they think they've already won. "You'll regret this, Whitman. Judges don't look kindly on guys who act out of pride." Preston smiled to himself. "And they don't look kindly on bosses who screw their employees and pay for hotel rooms on the company card. Enjoy explaining that to your board." The silence on the line this time belonged to Neil. Preston hung up before the man could respond. By the end of the day, whispers had started. The cleaning contracts Preston's company serviced included more than one downtown law office, more than one firm tied into the same business community Neil operated in. Word spread fast in those circles. An affair with an employee was one thing. Using company resources to fund it was another. Preston didn't need to shout. He just needed to let Neil's arrogance rot him from the inside out. That night, Valerie called again. Her voice was softer this time, desperate, nearly breaking. Please, Preston, don't ruin us. Don't ruin me. We can fix this. I'll end it with Neil. Preston interrupted, tone flat as steel. You ended it the night you said, so what? She tried to speak, but he hung up again. He stared at the phone for a long moment afterward, not because he doubted himself, but because the simplicity of those words still amazed him. 2 syllables had taken a marriage, a home, and a family, and smashed them like glass on concrete. But now he wasn't the one sweeping up. He was the one holding the broom, deciding what stayed and what got thrown out. And for the first time, Valerie was learning she didn't control the cleanup. By the 3rd week, Valerie's calls had slowed. The pleading had curdled into silence, the kind that carries danger under the surface. Preston knew she wasn't finished. Cheaters never stop at the first wall. They start digging for another way out. The storm came on a Thursday morning when David called. You need to come in. Now. Preston drove straight to the office, a knot already forming in his gut. David spread papers across the desk the moment he arrived. Bank statements, wire transfer slips, offshore account numbers in the Caymans. All in Preston's name. They were delivered to opposing counsel, David said, claiming you siphoned business funds out of Whitman Cleaning and hid them offshore. If this stuck, you'd be looking at felony charges and financial ruin. Preston scanned the documents. His signature was there, crooked, clumsy, almost right. Almost. She forged this, Preston said. David nodded grimly. Sloppy job. She copied an old signature from a joint tax form. Problem is, if a judge bought it for even a second, you'd be on defense instead of offense. Preston exhaled slowly, controlling the fire in his chest. This was Valerie's move. When charm and pity failed, she'd gone for crime. She doesn't know my system, Preston said finally. My company accounts require biometric verification. Fingerprint scans tied to my ID card. She couldn't have accessed them if she tried. David's mouth curved into something almost like a smile. Exactly what I was hoping you'd say, because that makes her not just a liar, but a criminal. They gathered the proof. Security logs showing his fingerprint entries, timestamps that didn't match her forged documents, witness testimony from his accountant. By afternoon, David had filed a motion accusing Valerie of fraud and forgery. Preston walked out of the office lighter, not because it was over, but because every false step Valerie took was another shovel of dirt she was throwing onto her own future. That night, he picked Luna up from orchestra practice. She climbed into the truck, violin case sliding into the back seat. She buckled in, looked at him with those sharp eyes of hers, and asked, "What did Mom do now?" Preston kept one hand on the wheel, the other drumming lightly against the console. "She made some bad choices," he said carefully. "Worse than before?" He nodded once. "Yeah, worse than before." Luna stared out the window for a moment. Then she said quietly, "She doesn't even look at me the same anymore. Like I'm in the way." Preston's chest tightened. He reached over, squeezed her shoulder. "Listen to me. None of this is your fault. And don't ever let fear excuse dishonesty. You hear me? Fear makes people stupid, but it doesn't make lying right." Luna nodded, blinking hard. She turned her face back to the glass, but Preston caught her reflection in the window. She understood more than any 12-year-old should. Later that night, his phone buzzed again. This time it was David. "Her lawyer just withdrew," he said. "Didn't want to be tied to fraud charges. Valerie's on her own now." Preston leaned back in the hotel armchair, the city lights washing over him through the window. He felt no victory, no gloating, just clarity. Valerie wasn't unraveling because of him. She was unraveling because lies always collapse when pressed against the truth. And he was pressing with everything he had. The call came late on a Tuesday. Preston was reviewing schedules for a new downtown contract when Luna answered the house phone. Her voice carried into the kitchen. "Dad, it's Mom. She sounds weird." Preston took the receiver. Valerie's voice was thin, trembling. "I'm in the hospital," she said. "Stress. Complications. They're not sure about the baby." For a long moment he said nothing. His jaw clenched, his thumb rubbing the edge of the counter. She had already lied, cheated, and forged. Now she wanted him to believe she was the victim. "Which hospital?" he asked flatly. She named it. Against his better judgment, Preston drove over. Not for her, but because he knew if Luna ever asked, he could tell her straight he had at least checked. Valerie was in a gown, monitors beeping softly, for dripping. Her face was pale, makeup smudged. She looked up at him with wide, pleading eyes. "You came," she whispered, as if that alone proved something. Preston stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed. "What do you want?" She pressed her hand to her stomach, her lips trembling. "I don't want to lose this baby. Neil, he's not built for this. He's already pulling away. You're the only man I ever trusted to be a father. Please, help me raise this child. Even if it isn't yours. You've always been steady, dependable. We could adopt it together. Start over." Preston's eyes hardened. The audacity of it. She wanted him to clean up her mess, to raise another man's child as if betrayal could be paved over with a crib and lullabies. He leaned forward slightly, voice low, steady. "You slept with him. You lied to me. You tried to frame me for fraud. And now you want me to be the father of his child." Tears welled in her eyes. "Please, Preston, don't be cruel. I can't do this alone." He straightened. "Then don't. But I won't be your solution." Her face twisted, part sorrow, part fury. The monitors beeped faster. For a second, Preston thought she might collapse right there. Instead, she turned her face away, muttering, "You'll regret this." The next day, David called. "You're not going to like this," he said. "Valerie just filed an emergency motion. Custody." Preston gripped the phone. "On what grounds?" "She's accusing you of psychological abuse. Claims you've been manipulating Luna, turning her against her mother, creating an unsafe environment." Preston's laugh was bitter. "She's the one who blew up the family. She's desperate," David said. "Desperate people sling mud. The good news? Judges like evidence. And we've got piles. But it means the next few months are going to be a war." That night, Preston sat at the kitchen table with Luna. She was sketching in her notebook, drawing her violin like she always did. He didn't want to drag her into adult battles, but she needed to hear the truth from him, not whispers from her mother. "Luna," he said carefully, "your mom might say some things in the next few weeks, things about me. None of them are true. Do you understand?" She set her pencil down and looked at him straight. "She already told me you're trying to steal me away from her." Preston exhaled through his nose, the anger rising again but kept in check. "I'm not stealing anything. I'm protecting you. From lies. From people who care more about themselves than the truth." Luna studied him, her young face wise beyond her years. "I believe you, Dad. I always will." He reached across the table, squeezed her hand once. Firm. "Good. Because this is going to get rough. But we'll come out the other side. Together." Outside, the night was quiet. Inside, Preston felt the storm sharpening. Valerie had played her last card. Pity hadn't worked. Now she wanted to weaponize their daughter. That was the line. She was about to learn what happened when you pushed a steady man too far. 6 months later, the stale chill of the courthouse hung heavy in the air. Preston adjusted his tie, not because he cared about appearances but because he knew optics mattered. Judge Martinez wasn't here for theatrics. She was here for facts, and facts were all he had brought. Valerie sat across the aisle, her hair styled sharp, her face painted in careful innocence. Neil wasn't beside her anymore. He had cut ties once the scandal hit his company, leaving her with his child and his silence. She glanced at Preston once, her eyes still carrying that same entitled defiance, but it wavered when she saw how calm he was. David leaned in. "Stick to the plan. Don't let her bait you. We've got her dead to rights." The bailiff called the session to order. Judge Martinez entered, robe swaying, her gaze sharp as steel. "We are here on the matter of Whitman versus Whitman, custody and division of assets." Valerie's lawyer tried first, spinning a story about a controlling husband who poisoned his daughter against her mother. Valerie dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, playing the victim for the gallery. Preston sat stone-faced, hands clasped, waiting. When David stood, his voice was measured, almost surgical. Your Honor, we intend to demonstrate not only Mrs. Whitman's infidelity, but also her attempts at fraud and forgery in this very courtroom. We will further present evidence confirming that the child she is currently carrying is not Mr. Whitman's, verified by paternity testing. The courtroom stirred. Valerie stiffened, color draining from her face. David clicked the remote, and the screen behind the judge lit up with evidence. Hotel receipts with Neil's corporate card, photographs synced from her phone, timestamps placing her with Neil in Atlanta when she claimed to be homesick. Then came the wire transfers, her crude forgery exposed by biometric security records. The final blow was the DNA test. Clear, scientific, undeniable. The child wasn't Preston's. Valerie's lawyer objected weakly, but Judge Martinez silenced him with a raised hand. She turned her gaze on Valerie. Do you dispute these results? Valerie's lips parted, but no words came. Her tissue crumpled in her fist. Judge Martinez leaned forward. Adultery, fraud, false accusations of abuse. Mrs. Whitman, your credibility is beyond repair. She shuffled the papers in front of her, then delivered the words Preston had been waiting for. Full legal and physical custody of the minor child, Luna Whitman, is awarded to her father. The marital residence and associated assets remain with Mr. Whitman. Mrs. Whitman will receive no spousal support. Visitation rights are limited to supervised sessions pending review. Additionally, charges of fraud will be referred to the district attorney's office. Valerie gasped, shaking her head violently. No, you can't. This isn't fair. The judge's gavel cracked against the wood. Court is adjourned. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Valerie sagged in her chair, mascara streaking down her cheeks. For the first time since that Tuesday night at the kitchen table, she looked defeated. Preston stood slowly, buttoned his jacket, and turned to leave. He didn't look at her again. She had wanted a war and she had gotten one. The difference was he fought with facts while she fought with lies. Luna met him in the hallway, a violin case slung over her shoulder. She'd been excused from testimony, too young to sit through the ugliness. When she saw him, she smiled, small, relieved, steady. Is it over? She asked. Preston placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the exit. Yeah, it's over. As they stepped out into the sunlight, Preston felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not joy, not triumph, just peace. The kind of peace that comes when a man knows he stood his ground, took the hits, and walked away stronger. Behind them, Valerie was left to answer for every choice she'd made. 1 year later, Preston's mornings looked different. No frantic calls, no tense silences at the dinner table, no waiting for the other shoe to drop. Just routine, steady, and calm, the kind of life he had always valued, now rebuilt from the ground up. At 6 a.m., he was in the warehouse checking supplies before the crews headed out. The company had grown. 2 new contracts, 15 employees on payroll, trucks painted with his logo rolling across Phoenix every morning. The business was sharp, profitable, and respected. People saw him as the man who kept his word and delivered clean results. No excuses. By 7, he was back home, packing Luna's lunch before school. She came downstairs with her violin case and a stack of sheet music, already chattering about an upcoming recital. She was thriving. Grades solid, music improving, her smile returning in ways Preston hadn't seen since before everything fell apart. He drove her to school each morning in his old Ford. The radio tuned low, her laughter filling the cab. It was their time. No interruptions, no lies hanging between them. Just a father and daughter, bonded tighter than ever. Sometimes at night, when the house was quiet, he thought about Valerie. She lived in a cramped apartment across town, raising Neil's abandoned child on her own. Neil had vanished. His career burned to ash after whispers of company funds paying for hotel rooms reached his board. Valerie had tried to claw her way back. Appeals, angry voicemails, pity-soaked letters. None of it mattered. The court orders held. The damage was permanent. Preston didn't feel joy in her downfall. He didn't need revenge anymore. Her life was the natural consequence of her choices. She had traded a steady husband and a family for cheap attention and lies, and the cost had finally come due. His peace came from something else. One evening, he and Luna sat on the back porch, watching the desert sky bleed into orange and purple. She was tuning her violin, plucking strings carefully, while Preston sipped a cold beer. The silence was comfortable, earned. "Dad?" she asked suddenly, not looking up from the instrument. "Yeah. Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" He thought for a moment, staring at the horizon. The easy answer was yes. He wished Valerie had been faithful, that their family had stayed intact. But the truth was harder, sharper. "I wish your mom had been the person I thought she was," he said finally. "But if she had been, we wouldn't be sitting here like this. You and me stronger. Sometimes life burns down so you can build it right the second time." Luna nodded, her fingers sliding over the strings. "I like the second version better." Preston smiled, the corners of his mouth tightening just enough. "Me too, kiddo. Me too." As the sun dipped and the first stars appeared, Preston felt something settle in his chest. Not the heavy weight of anger, not the ache of betrayal, just the solid calm of a man who had walked through fire and come out steady. He had lost a marriage, but he had kept his dignity. He had taken every cheap shot Valerie threw and turned them back on her without lowering himself. And most importantly, he had protected Luna, not just with custody papers and lawyers, but with truth. That was the foundation he'd built now, one of honesty, resilience, and strength. Not perfect, not painless, but real. The kind of foundation a man could stand on without fear of it cracking again.
Subscribe and stay one step ahead of cheaters. And trust me, the next story makes this one look like a fairy tale.